July 1099. The walls of Jerusalem had stood for centuries. Empires had fought over it. Armies had bled beneath it. But what happened that summer was not just another siege. It was a collision of faith, fear, hunger, and exhaustion, and it would reshape the medieval world in ways no one present could fully understand. On this channel, we don't just recount famous battles or dramatic moments. We explore the forces beneath them, the systems, pressures, and decisions that made those moments inevitable. History rarely turns on a single day. It turns when years of tension finally find a breaking point. The capture of Jerusalem during the First Crusade is often remembered as a triumph, or as a tragedy depending on who tells the story. But this is not just a story about one city changing hands. It is a story about why thousands of people walked across continents, why they kept going even when logic said they should turn back, and why, once they arrived, restraint vanished. This isn't simply about who won Jerusalem, it's about why medieval Europe believed it had no choice but to try. At the end of the 11th century, Western Europe was not a confident civilization marching outward. It was fractured, violent, and unstable. Local lords fought private wars. Knights trained for battle but often had no enemy except their neighbors. Peasants endured famine cycles and insecurity. The warrior class had been created, but it had no unified purpose. Meanwhile, to the east, the Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power of the region, was weakening. Territories had been lost, trade routes were threatened, borders were porous. In 1071, the Byzantines suffered a devastating defeat at Mazikert. Large parts of Anatolia slipped from their control. For the first time in centuries, the empire feared collapse from within. Their emperor appealed westward for help, not for a holy war, but for professional soldiers. What arrived instead was something far larger. In 1095, at a council in France, Pope Urban II delivered a speech that reframed the entire situation. Helping Byzantium became a sacred duty. Traveling east became an act of penance. Fighting became a path to salvation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not just knights, not just soldiers, entire populations began to move. Families sold everything they owned. Farmers abandoned fields. Children walked beside armored nobles. This was not an army in the modern sense. It was a migration fueled by belief. And belief does not obey logistics. The journey to Jerusalem was brutal beyond expectation. Crusader groups marched thousands of kilometers with limited supplies, no unified command, and little understanding of the terrain. Many died before ever seeing the Holy Land. Others turned on local populations along the way, driven by hunger and fear. When the main forces finally reached the eastern Mediterranean, they were no longer fresh warriors inspired by a speech years earlier. They were survivors, starving, disease-ridden, exhausted. They had endured sieges, betrayals, desert crossings, and internal disputes. Victory was no longer a noble goal. It was the only justification for everything they had lost. By June 1099, the remaining Crusader forces reached Jerusalem. They expected a fortified city, but not one so well prepared. The defenders had stocked food and water. Surrounding land had been stripped bare to deny supplies to the attackers. Summer heat pressed down relentlessly. The Crusaders had numbers, but they had almost nothing else. A siege requires patience. Patience requires resources. They had neither. Water was scarce. Wood for siege engines had to be hauled from miles away. Men collapsed from dehydration before ever reaching the walls. Discipline began to fray. Some leaders argued for negotiation. Others demanded immediate assault before morale collapsed completely. Religious rituals intensified. Fasting, barefoot processions, public prayers, attempts to impose order on chaos through faith. But faith could not fill empty stomachs. Inside the city, defenders watched from the walls, confident that time favored them. Every day the Crusaders remained outside increased the chance that disease or desertion would break the siege. The Crusader leaders understood this. Waiting meant defeat, so they committed to one decisive gamble. Massive wooden towers and battering devices were constructed under extreme conditions. Transporting them across uneven ground toward the walls required coordination the Crusader armies had rarely demonstrated. For once, impulse gave way to discipline. On July 14th to 15th, 1099, the final assault began. Siege towers rolled forward under covering fire. Arrows darkened the sky. Defenders hurled stones, fire, and boiling substances downward for hours. Neither side gained a decisive advantage. Then, at one section of the wall, a tower aligned perfectly with the defenses. A drawbridge dropped. A small group of crusaders crossed first, not a wave, but a trickle. But in siege warfare, a small breach is enough. Once attackers gained a foothold on the wall, defenders were forced into close combat. Positions that had been secure became vulnerable from behind. Coordination broke down. Soon gates were opened from within. The Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was not a controlled occupation. It was an explosion of pent-up terror, grief, hunger, and religious fervor. Years of suffering found release in a single day. Chroniclers from multiple sides described widespread killing Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians caught in the chaos. Looting followed. Fires burned. This was not strategy. It was collapse of restraint. By evening, Jerusalem was firmly in Crusader hands. After nearly 4 years of marching, fighting, and surviving, the objective had been achieved. But capturing Jerusalem did not end the story. In many ways it began a new and far more complicated one. The Crusaders established new states in the region, attempting to hold territory far from their homelands. Supply lines stretched across continents. Reinforcements arrived slowly, if at all. They were now rulers of lands they did not fully understand, surrounded by populations who did not welcome them. Meanwhile, news of the conquest traveled back to Europe. For some it confirmed divine favor, for others it revealed the scale of violence unleashed in the name of faith. In the Islamic world, the loss of Jerusalem became a rallying point, not immediately, but over time. Leaders who had previously been divided began to frame resistance as a shared duty. The First Crusade succeeded largely because its opponents were fragmented. Future crusades would face far more unified resistance. The event also reshaped European identity. It demonstrated that large numbers of people could be mobilized across vast distances under a religious banner. It normalized the idea of holy war as a recurring policy, not a one-time expedition. Trade routes shifted, cultural exchanges intensified, hostilities hardened. Jerusalem itself would change hands multiple times in the centuries that followed, but the memory of 1099 never disappeared. It became a symbol interpreted differently by every generation that inherited it. The capture of Jerusalem during the First Crusade was not inevitable. It depended on fragile supply lines, unstable alliances, desperate decisions, and the willingness of thousands to endure suffering beyond reason. It was less a story of unstoppable faith than of exhausted people refusing to admit that their journey had been for nothing. History often remembers the moment of victory, but behind that moment are years of uncertainty, miscalculation, and sheer endurance. Jerusalem fell in 1099 not because one side was destined to win, but because, at that precise moment, one group had reached the point where turning back felt impossible. If you want to understand history, you have to look at those moments when ordinary limits break, and the consequences echo for centuries. If there's another historical event you'd like explored in this calm, cinematic style, let me know in the comments. And if you found this story worth your time, consider liking the video and subscribing for more deep dives into the decisions that shaped our world. Because the past is not just a sequence of dates, it is a map of human choices, and we are still living with the results.